Everyone on that flight thought it was just another spoiled rich man's problem. A billionaire father, a baby crying non-stop, and a plane full of annoyed passengers. Angry airplane, but no one knew that the person who would silence those cries wasn't a doctor, a nanny, or the flight crew. It was a poor, elderly black woman sitting quietly in the back. And what she did next left the entire plane speechless and in tears. Heartbreak sparkles. Before we begin, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to Gentle Words for more heart-touching stories. The first-class cabin of Flight 247 from New York to Paris was supposed to be silent, peaceful, and luxurious. The dimmed lights gave everything a soft golden glow, the smell of freshly brewed coffee floated in the air, and the sound of engines was like a steady whisper beneath the seats. But then, cutting through the calm like a blade through silk, came a piercing cry. High, sharp, relentless. A baby's cry, not just a whimper or fuss, but a full-throated, soul-shaking cry that refused to stop. In seat 1A sat Richard Wallace, a man who owned private jets, five-star hotels, and entire companies. But today, despite all his wealth and status, he looked small, a tired father clutching his 8-month-old baby boy, Caleb, who was screaming as if the world had turned against him. Richard's hair was slightly messy, his tie loosened, and his hands trembled a little as he rocked the baby back and forth. His expensive watch reflected the cabin lights, but none of his money could buy him silence or peace in this moment. Richard whispered, almost pleading, "Please, Caleb, please stop crying." His voice cracked slightly. He had closed billion-dollar deals with a calm face. He had stood on stage in front of thousands with confidence. But right now, alone with his crying child, he felt helpless. Caleb's little fists punched the air, his face was flushed red, tears streaked down his soft cheeks, and his cries grew louder and louder. A woman sitting a few seats away rolled her eyes and muttered, "This is first class, not a daycare." Another man took off his headphones and sighed dramatically, shaking his head. A couple leaned toward each other and whispered, "Billionaire can buy a jet but can't calm his own baby." Richard heard those words. Every one of them stung like a needle in his heart. He wasn't just dealing with the baby's cries, he was dealing with his own guilt. His wife, Amelia, had died giving birth to Caleb. He had been a powerful man, but the day she left this world, something inside him broke. Since then, every cry from Caleb reminded him of how alone he was. How unprepared, how lost. He had tried to fill that emptiness with the best nannies, expensive lullaby machines, baby whisperers, and luxury comfort, but none of it could replace a mother's warmth. Flight attendants rushed over with worried faces. "Mr. Wallace, would you like us to bring a bottle? Perhaps some warm milk?" one asked softly. Richard shook his head. "I've tried everything. He doesn't want anything. He looked down at the small, screaming face in his arms. "Won't stop." Caleb's cries didn't just echo in the cabin, they filled Richard's chest with pain. He wanted to be strong. He wanted to be the kind of father Amelia would have been proud of. But tonight, at 35,000 feet, he felt like a failure. Meanwhile, far behind him in seat 31C, in the cramped economy class, sat Mrs. Ethel Johnson, a 74-year-old black woman with warm brown skin, gray hair tied into a neat bun, and kind eyes that carried years of stories. Her hands were rough from years of cleaning homes, cooking, and holding children. Her faded blue dress and worn shoes showed a life of simplicity, not wealth. She held a small, old handbag with a photo of her grandchildren tucked inside. This was her first plane ride in more than 40 years. She had saved for this trip for 2 long years, working double shifts just to afford the ticket. She was on her way to Paris to see her granddaughter, who had just given birth to a baby girl. When she first heard Caleb cry, she didn't feel annoyed like the others. She didn't roll her eyes or sigh. She simply closed her eyes and listened. A mother's ear doesn't just hear sound, it hears need. She recognized the rhythm of that cry. It wasn't hunger, it wasn't pain, it was loneliness. She had heard the same cry from her own babies many years ago, in a tiny wooden house where love was plenty but money was scarce. She whispered softly to herself, "Oh, little one, you're just scared." As the cries grew louder, Ethel's heart grew heavier. She could feel the judgment in the air, the whispers, the irritation, the way people acted as if a baby's pain was an inconvenience rather than a cry for comfort. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt. Her joints ached as she stood, steadying herself on the armrest. A flight attendant noticed and hurried over. "Ma'am, you need to remain seated. We're mid-flight." But Ethel placed her wrinkled hand gently on the young woman's arm and said in a calm, motherly voice, "Child, let me help that baby." There was something about the way she said it, gentle but firm, like the kind of voice that had quieted many storms. The attendant hesitated. After a moment, she nodded and stepped aside. Ethel walked slowly toward the first-class cabin. Heads turned as she passed. Some people frowned, others whispered. Richard looked up, startled, as he saw the elderly woman approach. "Sir," she said softly, "may I hold him?" For a moment, Richard froze. He didn't know this woman. But there was no judgment in her eyes, only kindness. He whispered, I've tried everything." His voice broke a little. Ethel smiled gently, extending her arms. "Sometimes, sugar, they just need a heartbeat." Without another word, Richard carefully handed Caleb over. The moment Ethel's warm, weathered hands cradled the baby, the air changed. Caleb's tiny fist stopped thrashing. His cries softened into whimpers, then hiccups, and then silence. Complete silence. The cabin froze. The passengers who had been complaining a moment ago leaned forward in surprise. A man who had rolled his eyes now stared in quiet awe. A woman whispered, "Oh my God." Ethel sat down in the empty seat beside Richard, rocking the baby with the ease of someone who had done it thousands of times. She began to hum an old church lullaby, soft and low. It wasn't a song from the radio or a fancy baby sound machine. It was a song that had comforted her own children through storms, through hunger, through long nights. Caleb rested his head on her chest, his tiny fingers clutching the fabric of her faded dress. He listened to her heartbeat, steady and warm, and drifted into calmness as if her arms were the safest place in the world. Richard stared, his eyes filling with tears. "How did you?" he whispered. She smiled softly. "I've held a lot of babies in my time. Babies don't care about money. They just want to feel safe." Her words hit him harder than any boardroom speech, any headline, any deal. For the first time in months, Richard felt something melt inside him, a mix of grief, love, and relief. For the rest of the flight, Ethel held Caleb like a grandmother holding her own grandchild. She hummed, whispered little stories, and even made the billionaire laugh. People who had been annoyed minutes earlier now watched with soft smiles. One woman whispered to her husband, "She's like an angel." Richard couldn't take his eyes off her. He wasn't just seeing a kind woman. He was seeing something money could never buy: real love. When the flight finally began to descend, Caleb was fast asleep in Ethel's arms. His breathing was steady, his cheeks soft and peaceful. Ethel gently handed him back to Richard, who held him with new tenderness. As the passengers began to disembark, Richard turned to Ethel with tears in his eyes. "Thank you. I don't even know how to repay you. I can give you anything. A house, money, whatever you want." But Ethel just shook her head slowly and smiled. "No, sugar, I don't need a thing. Just promise me one thing. Don't let the world raise him. You hold him. You love him. Because that's all he'll ever need." Richard swallowed hard. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. Not like a businessman, not like a billionaire, but like a father. He reached out and held her hand. "I promise." Ethel smiled and patted his hand with a warmth only a grandmother could give. "Good. Then he'll grow up just fine." As Ethel walked back toward the terminal, most of the passengers didn't even know her name. But Richard did, and in his heart, he knew he would never forget that moment. The woman everyone ignored had done what no amount of money could. She had reminded him how to love. For weeks after the flight, Richard Wallace couldn't stop thinking about her. Ethel Johnson. That name was etched into his mind like a quiet hymn. The image of her weathered hands gently holding Caleb, the sound of her humming that lullaby, the way his son, restless, inconsolable Caleb, had melted into calm against her chest. It wasn't just what she did. It was what she gave him in that moment. She gave him hope. In the days that followed, Richard found himself holding his son differently. Not like something fragile he might break, but like something precious he wanted to protect. He started humming at night, awkwardly at first, out of tune, but full of love. He no longer left Caleb with nannies during the nights. He held him. He rocked him. He listened to his tiny heartbeat and let his son's breathing guide his own. In the quiet hours of the night, when Caleb's soft breaths warmed his chest, Richard often whispered, "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson." But he couldn't let her just disappear. She had been a stranger on a flight. And yet she had changed the course of his and his son's life forever. One evening, after putting Caleb to sleep, Richard called his assistant and said, "Find her." "Sir, who?" "The elderly woman from flight 247. Her name is Ethel Johnson. She sat in economy. She lives in the US somewhere. Find her. I need to see her again." For most people, that would have been nearly impossible. But Richard Wallace was not most people. When he set his heart on something, whether a business deal or a lost piece of hope, he found it. Within a week, they had located her. She lived in a small house in a quiet neighborhood in Georgia. Her life was simple. She lived alone, spending most of her days tending to her small garden and watching her grandchildren on weekends. She was still the same woman who had boarded that plane in her faded dress. Richard didn't send her money. He didn't send flowers. He didn't want to turn a moment of kindness into a transaction. Instead, one warm afternoon, Ethel opened her door and saw a tall man standing on her porch holding a little baby, the same one she'd cradled in the sky. "Mr. Wallace," she said with wide eyes. He smiled gently. "Please, call me Richard." She laughed softly, covering her mouth with her hand. "I didn't expect to ever see you again." Richard shifted Caleb gently in his arms. "I couldn't forget you. You saved us that night. You didn't just calm my son. You reminded me what love looks like." Ethel's eyes softened. "Oh honey, all I did was hold a baby." "No," Richard whispered. "You held my heart." They sat together on the porch, the warm sun casting soft golden light on the faded wooden steps. Richard told her how that night had changed everything. How he'd learned to hold his son, not as a duty, but as a father. How he'd stopped hiding behind work. How he'd started living again. Tears shimmered in Ethel's eyes as she listened. "That's what love does, child. It wakes us up." From that day forward, Ethel became more than just a stranger he met on a flight. She became family. Richard started visiting her every month with Caleb. She cooked for them, told stories about her youth, taught him old lullabies. And Caleb? Oh, Caleb adored her. Every time he saw her, his tiny arms reached out for her as if he knew exactly where home was. Richard wasn't looking for a replacement for Amelia. He knew no one could ever replace the love of his late wife. But in Ethel, he found something he didn't know he was missing, a gentle anchor. A grandmotherly soul who loved not because of who he was, but simply because love was her nature. Time passed like soft wind. Caleb grew from a baby into a bright, curious little boy. He learned to walk on the same porch where Ethel had first rocked him. He learned to speak his first words, Mama, for the mother he'd never known, and Nana, for the woman who gave him comfort. Richard often sat on the porch watching them together, the poor elderly woman and the billionaire's son, and thought, this is what matters. But time, as gentle as it can be, is also unstoppable. Ethel grew older. Her hands that once held Caleb so firmly began to tremble a little more each year. But she never stopped holding him. Not once. One cold winter, when Caleb was 8 years old, Richard got a call. "Mr. Wallace, it's about Mrs. Johnson." The words that followed hit him like a storm. She was in the hospital. Her heart was weak. Richard dropped everything. The meetings, the business trips, the world, and flew to Georgia with Caleb. When they entered her hospital room, she was lying in bed, frail but smiling the moment she saw them. "There's my boy," she whispered, her voice soft but warm. Caleb rushed to her side, holding her hand tightly. "Nana, don't be sick." Ethel chuckled weakly, brushing a small curl from his forehead. "Oh, sweet boy, I've had a long, beautiful life. Don't cry for me, smile for me." Richard sat beside her, his throat tight. He wanted to say so much. "Thank you, please don't go, your family," but no words came. Only tears. She squeezed his hand gently. "Don't look so sad, sugar. We all go home someday." He whispered, "You gave us everything. You saved us." "No," she smiled. You saved yourself the day you chose to love that boy. I just reminded you how. A single tear slipped down Richard's cheek. Ethel turned her gaze toward Caleb, who was hugging her arm like he used to as a baby. Listen to me, little one. You're going to grow up strong, kind, and good. And when you love people, love them the way you were loved. That's all the world needs. He nodded, tears streaming down his little face. I love you, Nana. And I love you more, baby boy. That was the last conversation they had. Ethel passed away 2 days later in her sleep, peaceful and warm, just as she had lived her life. Her funeral was simple, just as she had wished. But what she never expected was the crowd that came. Dozens of people she'd touched over the years. Families she'd worked for, children she'd cared for, and right in the front row sat a billionaire and his little boy, crying not for a woman who had wealth or fame, but for a woman who had love. Richard made sure her grave was surrounded by flowers all year round. And on every anniversary of that day on the plane, the day their lives changed, he and Caleb would fly back to Georgia. They would bring her flowers, sit by her grave, and tell her all about their lives. As Caleb grew older, Ethel's words became his compass. He studied hard, grew into a kind young man, and whenever life got hard, he remembered the warmth of her arms. Years later, when Caleb graduated with honors, he walked up on stage and gave a speech. His voice trembled as he said, "Greater than, I don't remember my mother. She passed away the day I was born. But God didn't leave me alone. When I was just a baby crying on a plane, a woman, a stranger, held me. Her name was Mrs. Ethel Johnson. She wasn't rich, she wasn't famous, but her love changed my father's heart. Her love changed my life. She taught me that family isn't just blood. It's love, pure, simple love, and because of her, I'll spend my life giving others the same love she gave me." The entire room stood in silence, some with tears in their eyes. Richard, sitting in the front row, pressed a hand to his heart. He saw in his son everything Ethel had hoped for. That night, after the celebration, Caleb and Richard stood together under a quiet sky. Richard whispered, "She'd be so proud of you." Caleb smiled softly, "She's with us, Dad. She never really left." Richard nodded, and in the wind that brushed gently against their cheeks, they both felt her, not as a memory, but as a heartbeat.